What if I told you that the very act of trying to burn fat might be the reason your body refuses to let it go? There exists within the human body a beautiful and terrible irony that most of us encounter without ever recognizing its presence. We wake up one morning, notice the way our clothes fit differently, see the subtle accumulation around our midsection, and something inside us clicks into determination mode. We decide that today is the day we take control. We cut our calories dramatically. We push ourselves harder in our workouts. We tell ourselves that discipline and willpower will reshape our bodies through sheer force of intention. And yet, for so many of us, the body responds not with cooperation, but with stubborn resistance, as if it has locked away the very fat we are trying to eliminate and hidden the key somewhere we cannot reach. This is not a failure of character or commitment. This is biochemistry asserting itself with indifferent precision. When we approach fat loss through the lens of aggression, when we treat our bodies like adversaries that must be conquered, we activate an ancient survival system that interprets our efforts as a threat. The hormone cortisol rises in response to what the body perceives as danger, whether that danger comes from a predator in the wild or from the modern stressor of severe caloric restriction combined with intense physical exertion. Cortisol does not understand our aesthetic goals or our health aspirations. It understands only survival, and in the language of survival, stored energy around the vital organs represents insurance against uncertain times. What makes this particularly fascinating from a physiological standpoint is that cortisol actively promotes the accumulation and retention of visceral fat, the deep abdominal fat that wraps around our internal organs. This is not random. Visceral fat cells have more cortisol receptors than subcutaneous fat cells, the fat that sits just beneath the skin. When cortisol floods the system, it finds these receptors like a key finding a lock, and it signals the body to preserve and even expand these deposits. The body is essentially saying that if times are hard, if resources are scarce, if stress is high, then we need to protect our core, our center, our most vital structures with an energy reserve that can be accessed quickly when needed. The paradox deepens when we consider that visceral fat itself becomes metabolically active in ways that perpetuate the very conditions that created it. This fat tissue releases inflammatory compounds and hormones that can further elevate cortisol levels, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. The more we stress, the more visceral fat we store. The more visceral fat we store, the more our inflammatory markers rise. The more inflammation present in the system, the more the body remains in a state of perceived threat, keeping cortisol elevated and the fat locked firmly in place. If cortisol operates as the body's alarm system, then insulin functions as its storage manager, and these two hormones communicate with each other in a language far older than conscious thought. When we eat, particularly when we consume carbohydrates, our blood sugar rises, and the pancreas releases insulin to shuttle that glucose into cells, where it can be used for energy or stored for later. This is normal, healthy, and exactly what should happen. But when cortisol enters this equation at elevated levels, it fundamentally alters the conversation between insulin and our cells, creating a metabolic tension that has profound implications for where and how our bodies store fat. Cortisol has a primary directive that supersedes almost everything else in moments of stress: keep blood sugar available for immediate use. In the wild, this makes perfect sense. If you are running from danger or fighting for survival, your muscles need glucose readily accessible in the bloodstream, not locked away inside cells. So cortisol actively works against insulin's storage signals, creating what we call insulin resistance. The cells become less responsive to insulin's knock on the door, leaving glucose circulating in the blood longer than it should. The pancreas detects this elevated blood sugar and responds by producing even more insulin, trying to force the cells to accept the glucose through sheer volume of signal. Now we have both cortisol and insulin elevated simultaneously, a metabolic state that the human body was never designed to maintain chronically. This combination creates a perfect storm for visceral fat accumulation. The high insulin levels signal fat storage, while the cortisol specifically directs that storage toward the abdominal region, particularly the deep visceral compartments. Meanwhile, the insulin resistance means that muscle cells, which should be the primary destination for glucose, are refusing entry, leaving the liver and fat cells as the main recipients of this excess energy. The liver converts what it cannot immediately process into triglycerides, and these often find their way into visceral fat deposits. What makes this dance particularly insidious is its self-perpetuating nature. Visceral fat, once established, releases its own cascade of signaling molecules, including substances that further promote insulin resistance throughout the body. The fat tissue itself begins to behave almost like an endocrine organ, secreting hormones and inflammatory compounds that keep both insulin and cortisol disrupted. This creates a metabolic trap where the body exists in a constant state of mixed signals: store energy, but also prepare for emergency; burn fat, but also protect vital reserves. The tragedy is that many conventional approaches to fat loss inadvertently worsen this hormonal discord. Severe caloric restriction elevates cortisol. Chronic high-intensity exercise without adequate recovery elevates cortisol. Poor sleep elevates cortisol. Each of these stressors pushes insulin sensitivity further out of balance, making the cells more resistant, forcing the pancreas to work harder, and ensuring that any food consumed gets preferentially routed toward visceral storage rather than being used efficiently for energy or directed toward muscle tissue where it might actually serve our functional goals. When the sun sets and darkness envelops our environment, the human body expects to enter a state of profound restoration, a nightly reset that goes far deeper than mere rest. Sleep is not passive downtime but an active metabolic process, during which the body recalibrates its hormonal symphony. And perhaps no hormone benefits more from quality sleep than cortisol itself. In the natural rhythm of a healthy system, cortisol should follow a predictable pattern, rising gently in the early morning hours to help us wake and greet the day, then declining steadily throughout the afternoon and evening until it reaches its lowest point in the deep hours of night. This decline is not optional or cosmetic, but essential for allowing the body to shift into repair mode. During deep sleep, particularly in those stages where brainwaves slow and consciousness drifts furthest from waking awareness, the body finally receives permission to release its defensive posture. The nervous system downshifts, stress hormones ebb, and in this state of biological safety, something remarkable occurs. The body begins to preferentially burn fat for fuel, oxidizing stored energy while sparing muscle tissue, all while you remain completely unaware. This overnight fasting period, where no food enters the system for 8 or more hours, allows insulin levels to drop naturally, creating the metabolic space for fat oxidation to proceed unimpeded. But this elegant process depends entirely on the quality and consistency of sleep. When sleep is fragmented, insufficient, or disrupted by light, noise, or anxiety, cortisol never completes its essential nighttime descent. It remains elevated, keeping the body in a subtle state of alert, signaling to every cell that danger might still lurk. In this state, the body refuses to access visceral fat stores, clinging instead to its reserves, perceiving the lack of rest itself as evidence that times are uncertain and energy must be conserved at the core. The human nervous system operates through two primary branches that function like opposing forces in constant negotiation. The sympathetic branch activates our fight-or-flight response, accelerating heart rate, sharpening focus, and mobilizing energy for immediate action. The parasympathetic branch does the opposite, slowing the heart, deepening breath, promoting digestion, and signaling to every cell that the present moment is safe enough for growth, repair, and release. These two systems cannot dominate simultaneously, and the body's willingness to let go of visceral fat depends almost entirely on which branch holds greater influence over the course of your days and nights. When the sympathetic nervous system runs the show chronically, which happens in our modern world of constant deadlines, notifications, and perceived threats, the body interprets this as living in a war zone. It does not matter that the threats are emails rather than predators. The physiological response remains remarkably similar. Cortisol stays elevated, adrenaline surges repeatedly throughout the day, and the metabolic message is clear: hold on to every possible energy reserve because we are under siege. Visceral fat becomes untouchable, protected by layers of hormonal signaling that treat it as the last line of defense against catastrophe. The shift toward parasympathetic dominance requires deliberate cultivation of safety signals that the primitive brain can recognize and trust. This happens through practices that seem almost absurdly simple: slow, diaphragmatic breathing that extends the exhale beyond the inhale, gentle movement that never pushes into pain or exhaustion, moments of stillness where the mind can observe without reacting. These are not mere relaxation techniques, but direct communications with the autonomic nervous system, biological switches that tell the body it can afford to release its grip, that survival is not in question, that the fat stored so protectively around vital organs can now be metabolized because the environment has proven itself stable and nourishing enough to permit such vulnerability. The body operates on rhythms far older than any diet, plan, or nutritional philosophy, cycles etched into our biology by millennia of sunrise and sunset, feast and famine, activity and rest. Every cell contains molecular clocks that anticipate when food will arrive, when energy will be needed, when repair should commence. These clocks communicate directly with our metabolic hormones, preparing the body to handle nutrients most efficiently at certain times while remaining relatively resistant at others. When we eat in alignment with these natural rhythms, we allow cortisol to follow its intended trajectory while simultaneously optimizing the body's ability to access stored fat for fuel. Morning light triggers a natural cortisol rise that serves a purpose beyond merely waking us. This dawn cortisol pulse primes the body for energy intake, making cells more insulin sensitive and better prepared to handle carbohydrates without excessive insulin release. Eating within a few hours of waking, when this natural cortisol elevation occurs, works with the rhythm rather than against it. As the day progresses and cortisol should naturally decline, the body becomes less efficient at processing large meals, particularly those heavy in carbohydrates and sugars. Eating late into the evening, when cortisol should be at its nadir, forces the body to produce insulin during a time when it expects to be fasting, disrupting the hormonal descent that permits overnight fat burning. The window of time we allow between our last meal of the day and our first meal of the following morning creates a metabolic space where magic quietly unfolds. During these hours of fasting, insulin remains low, glycogen stores in the liver gradually deplete, and the body begins to shift toward fat oxidation as its primary fuel source. This is not starvation but simply respecting the body's ancient expectation of nocturnal fasting, combined with low cortisol from quality sleep and parasympathetic dominance. This extended overnight period becomes the daily opportunity for visceral fat to release its contents into the bloodstream,